Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the second video in my not-so-hypothetical literature course series. If you do not know what this series is, basically back in October of last year I did a Q&A video and Chbosky asked me what my hypothetical Victorian literature course would be if I were a professor at a university. I then made a video about this hypothetical literature course and people seemed to like the idea, so I decided I would make it a not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course. And so I'm doing a series of long-ish videos on my channel talking about various different Victorian novels and different themes. So in the first episode in this series I talked about Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Great Expectations by Charles Dickens and compared those two novels in general, talking about the Victorian novel as a whole. And then today I'm going to be talking about the theme of industrialisation in North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell and Hard Times by Charles Dickens. As usual, the first half of this video will be spoiler free and the second half will be full of spoilers, so I will alert you halfway through where if you haven't read the books you should stop watching, but I will try and discuss as much as possible without any spoilers. Before I get on to talking about North and South and Hard Times, I do just quickly want to let you know what the next few topics and books will be in the ongoing not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course. In the month of July I'll be putting up a video exploring the theme of the city within Victorian literature, and I'm going to be looking at the novels The Netherworld by George Gissing and Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Then in the month of September I'm going to be looking at the role of small towns in Victorian literature, and I want to look at Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I'm finally going to reread, and also Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. So a very long one but also a very short one to kind of even it out there. Lots of Elizabeth Gaskell so far, she's a fascinating author. And then in the month of November, planning ahead, I'm going to be looking at the role of rural settings and the countryside in Victorian literature, and I'm going to be looking at Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and also Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, just to give you an idea of what's coming up. And if you want to read any of those books to read along with the series, then please do. However, this has been a long preamble. Let's finally get on to talking about industrialisation in Hard Times and in North and South. So this may be rather a long video. I made myself a plan in Microsoft Word. It's 2 pages long, so it might take me quite a while to get through everything I have to say about these two incredible books and the role of industrialisation, which is one of my favourite themes in Victorian literature. But hopefully it will be interesting nonetheless. And before I get on to talking about all of the small details that I want to pick apart in these two books, I do want to quickly tell you a little bit about what each of these is about and also about industrialisation in the Victorian period as a whole. So, North and South. As I mentioned in my wrap-up for April, this I have decided is probably my second favourite book of all time after Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I love it a great deal. I like to fondly refer to it as Pride and Prejudice and Factories, or Pride and Prejudice with a Social Conscience, but it is so much more than that. It is a really good love story and I do enjoy the love story. It's probably like my favourite love story ever in anything, but I'm not going to talk too much about the love story today, apart from the things that it might symbolise in terms of industrialisation. What I'm going to talk about instead is the other thing I really love about this book, which is the way that it explores industrialisation and the conflicts between masters and workers in factory towns in the 19th century, and the way that it explores the socio-economic and moral and cultural effects of industrialisation on the Victorian world. North and South is about a young woman called Margaret Hale. She has grown up in London and in a small town in the rural south called Helston. She lives with her father and her mother. Her father is a clergyman, but then one day her father begins to get doubts as to the validity of the Church of England as he gives up his profession as a clergyman, and he decides to move his family to the manufacturing town called Milton Northern. This is a fictional town based on 19th century Manchester. The book basically follows Margaret's life in Milton, and we get to see her as she discovers more about the industrial north. There are two significant relationships which Gaskell uses in North and South to explore the effect of industrialisation on people and to have a look at the way that this factory town works. One of them is Margaret's relationship with Mr. Thornton, who is a youngish man who is a manufacturer who owns a mill. He is a friend of her father's and is tutored by her father, and he is the other sort of point of view character in this book, I suppose. We also see into his head quite a lot. And then the other important relationship that Margaret has in this book is with a family called the Higginses, who are a working family. They work in factories. There is a father and 2 daughters, one of whom, Bessie, Margaret becomes very good friends with. This book is a fascinating, wonderful, beautiful, incredible book, and it has many fantastic, incredible, interesting things to say about industrialisation, which I will get more onto soon. Moving on to Hard Times by Charles Dickens. I love Hard Times less than North and South, I have to say. I do like it a lot, I still really enjoy it. It's one of those Dickens novels that I find incredibly interesting, but I don't find that perfect. Like, there's a weird thing in Hard Times where it sort of feels like every character is a minor character and you never really get to know anybody, but at the same time, what he's trying to do sort of philosophically, intellectually, morally is really, really interesting, this is the book of Dickens's which is the most like a manifesto. Now, Hard Times it's quite hard to explain the plot because, like I said, there are a lot of subplots and it doesn't really feel like there's necessarily one main plot, but it focuses on the fictional industrial town of Coketown, which was based on 19th century Preston, which is fairly near Manchester. Within this industrial town, Coketown, we have a set of people called the hard fact men. So they are men who are obsessed with facts, who are obsessed with political economy and with sort of the best outcome for the greatest number, with making money and with only thinking in fact. I'll explain a little bit more about this idea of the hard fact men later and read a few quotes from the beginning of the book which make it a bit clearer. But basically there is a man called Mr. Gradgrind and his friend Mr. Bounderby, who is a manufacturer. Mr. Gradgrind is an MP, and they have basically decide that the way to run the world is that everyone should think of facts and no one should care for imagination, no one should care for stories. Children should not be brought up to go to the circus or to read storybooks. No, that was incredibly wrong. They should be brought up on facts and facts alone. Mr. Gradgrind's two eldest children, Tom and Louisa, are also very important characters, and their relationship with the world due to their upbringing on hard facts is quite significant. We also have a few working class characters who work in the factories, Stephen and Rachel, who are important in this book. But basically in Hard Times, what Dickens is talking about and exploring in a really interesting way is the industrialization of the mind, the idea that industrialization and the changes that industrialization have brought on the country of Britain have changed the way that people think and mean that people are dismissing things that they can't establish as hard facts, and therefore they are cutting out love and imagination from their life, and that is bad. What is really interesting in looking at these two books in terms of the way they explore industrialization is that Hard Times is really about the intellectual and moral effects of industrialization, whereas North and South is much more, yes, it does look at the moral effects of industrialization, but it's much more about the socio-economic effects of industrialization, which is why I think these two books are very, very interesting to compare. They also have very, very different opinions on various things to do with industrialization. I think the North and South is probably a more complicated vision than Hard Times, but they're both brilliant, wonderful books and really interesting to look at. Before I get on to looking at how industrialization is explored in these two books, I also do want to say a little bit about industrialization in general. When I talk about industrialization in the Victorian period, I mean a few kind of separate movements. One is urbanization, the mass movement of people from the countryside to the cities. Another is the mass movement of labour from rural industries to manufacturing industries. And another is the mass movement of capital and money from landed aristocracy and trade to manufacturers. Suddenly in the 19th century there is a whole new class of people who are making their money from industry, from mills, from manufacturing clothes and various other things. Suddenly in the 19th century there's this whole new industry that just sucks up masses of capital, masses of labour, that outputs masses of capital, that has this staggering effect on society, and because it brings people to the cities to work also massively changes the social structures and the economic structures of the time. It is a huge change in the way that people live. I'll give you a few statistics to illustrate this. In 1801, the start of the 19th century, a fair while before the Victorian period, 33% of people in Britain lived in towns. By 1911, it was 79%. So that kind of tells you how much urbanisation there was for a start over the course of the 19th century. And in 1811, 34% of people in Britain worked in agriculture. By 1911, that was down to 7%, and this was partly due to a mass movement to people working in manufacturing and industry. In 1800, the UK produced 4% of the world's manufactured goods. By 1860 it was 20%, which shows you how much British industry changed over the first half of the 19th century. And there are a lot of different kinds of industry that this encompasses. The steel industry and coal mining were massively important parts of the Victorian economy, but both of these books, and what I'm mostly going to be focusing on today, is cotton mills and cotton manufacturing. Both of these books were published in the 1850s, Hard Times in 1854 and North and South in 1855, so really, really close together. And it's interesting that they were published so close together, and I do think that the 1850s, especially when people were starting to realise what a massive impact industrialisation was having on society as well. But anyway, that has been more than enough preamble about the books and about industrialisation. I have 8 different things, different areas, different subcategories of industrialisation that I want to talk about today. So yes, we may be here a while. Anyway, so to begin with, I want to talk about the industrialisation of the landscape and the way that these two books describe cities and the role of them. Obviously, in a few months' time, I'm going to do a separate video on the role of cities within the Victorian novel, but the role of the industrial city, of the factory town in these two books is really interesting, and the way that they are physically described and their effect on the landscape is described is very, very interesting as well. So I want to read you 2 passages, one from North and South, which describes Milton Northern, and one from Hard Times, which describes Coketown, to have a little look at the ways, the similarities and differences between the way these books describe cities and industrial factory towns. Let us strike the keynote, Coketown, before pursuing our tune. It was a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it, but as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of them which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dyes, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the heads of an elephant in a strange state of melancholy madness. And this is from North and South. For several miles before they reached Milton, they saw a deep lead-coloured cloud hanging over the horizon in the direction in which it lay. Nearer to the town, the air had a faint taste and smell of smoke, perhaps after all more a loss of the fragrance of grass and herbage than any other positive taste or smell. Quickly they were whirled over long, straight, hopeless streets of regularly built houses, all small and of brick. Here and there a great oblong, many-windowed factory stood up, like a hen amongst her chickens, puffing out black, unparliamentary smoke, and sufficiently accounting for the cloud which Margaret had taken to foretell rain. Leaving aside Charles Dickens's casual racism, there are a lot of very, very interesting things in these two passages. Although they are describing different towns, they describe very, very similar things. The emphasis on smoke, the emphasis on brick houses, the emphasis on these factories with a lot of windows is really, really interesting. There are also a lot of other similarities in different parts of the book. So for example, in Hard Times, when they talk about a river that runs purple with dye, that is also mentioned at another point in North and South. Likewise, the fact that there is a huge cloud above the town of Milton in North and South, that is also mentioned with being the case of Coketown in Hard Times. It's also really interesting that both Elizabeth Gaskell and Charles Dickens decide that the only way they can describe what a factory is like is to use metaphors of animals. It's really interesting because basically the Victorians don't have the language to describe these things. Like, they don't know how to describe these new manufacturing towns because they are so new and so different that they have to resort to kind of weird imagery, which makes both descriptions feel a little bit surreal. At the same time, there's a great emphasis on the unnaturalness of these cities. So if you look at the description in North and South, what Margaret Hale took for a rain cloud was actually the pollution produced by Milton, the fact that the air smells of smoke rather than flowers. Gaskell is emphasising how unnatural this place is and how it is interfering with the rest of the natural world. And the same is definitely the case in Hard Times. Dickens strongly emphasises the unnaturalness of this city, the fact that there is a black canal and a river that runs purple, the fact that the houses are all made of red brick, except that it's not red, it's completely black because of all the soot. It's really interesting to look at how the cities are presented in Hard Times and North and South, because they are presented as these unnatural things, and yet they are so unnatural that the only way you can describe them is by using naturalistic similes and by comparing them to animals. It's really, really interesting. Another thing that's really interesting in both of these books is the comparison between rural and urban spaces. North and South, as much being a book about North versus South, is also a book about rural versus urban. And despite the fact that Margaret Hale has had this lovely upbringing in Helston and very much loves the rural place that she's from, the book is really quite balanced in a lot of ways and very complexly explores the differences between the countryside and the city and the hardships and pleasures of both. North and South doesn't exactly come down on either way. The city may be ugly and unnatural and may have horrible air, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. Whereas in Hard Times, I feel like the countryside definitely wins. I just want to read you one passage in Hard Times where two of the characters go outside into the countryside to look at the way that the countryside is compared in comparison to the town of Coketown. This is from quite late on in the book, but there are no spoilers. Like, this passage doesn't even mention the name of the two characters who are walking in the countryside, so anyway. Though the green landscape was blotted here and there with heaps of coal, it was green elsewhere, and there were trees to see, and there were larks singing, though it was Sunday, and there were pleasant scents in the air, and all was overarched by a bright blue sky. In the distance one way, Coketown showed as a black mist. In another, distant hills began to rise. In a third, there was a faint change in the light of the horizon where it shone upon the far-off sea. Under their feet the grass was fresh, beautiful shadows of branches flickered upon it and speckled it. Hedgerows were luxuriant, everything was at peace. If you compare that passage with the passage in which Dickens describes what Coketown is like, it's pretty clear where Dickens comes down on the side of the argument, and for him the countryside is blessed and it is a retreat. The countryside is what is natural and what is right and what is beautiful, whereas Coketown, the industrial city, is distinctly unnatural and ugly. But anyway, moving on to my next point. Next, I want to kind of continue talking about factory towns, but rather than talking about their effect on the landscape, I want to talk about their effect on the people, because what is very, very interesting about industrialisation in the Victorian period is that it creates mass urbanisation, and this obviously massively changes the way that societies are put together and the way that people live. By bringing together huge groups of people in large numbers to live very uniform lives in a way that hadn't really happened before, industrialisation really did change the way that people lived. So directly after the description of Coketown I already read is a description of the people within Coketown. It contained several large streets all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours with the same sound upon the same pavements to do the same work, to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. And what Dickens is looking at there is the way that mass industrialisation hugely changes the way people live and work, because people working in agriculture, one, there tended to be a much greater variety of what work people were doing. Also, people's work would vary incredibly with the time of day and with the season of the year, whereas in mill towns where people are working in factories, they tend to be doing the same work for the same hours every day of every year, often for all their lives. A lot of what Hard Times is about the loss of imagination and the loss of individuality, this idea that mass industrialisation, by creating this workforce who will work in the same uniform way, completely destroys individuality and eliminates real possibilities of happiness and of being your own person. And that is something in Hard Times that's really, really interesting. Of course, it's also very interesting and important to look at the effects of factories on the lives of workers and on their quality of life. I'm not going to talk about it that much here because I'm going to talk about it more in my spoilery section, because there's lots of stuff to do with the lives of workers that is huge spoilers in both of these books. So I'm going to leave that here and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. But what I am going to talk about now is industrialisation and class, because as I was just saying, industrialisation creates this massive new workforce, and by creating this massive new workforce it also creates this massive new class, because the difference in quality of life and in culture between people in agricultural and industrial workforces is massively, massively different. So this is one new class, and of course there is another class created by manufacturing towns. There is the class that Mr. Thornton in North and South and Mr. Bounderby in Hard Times inhabit, the class of the manufacturer. Where does Victorian society place manufacturers? They really don't know. They find it really difficult because people who own factories and mills tend to have quite a lot of money in the Victorian period. But many of them didn't start out life with a lot of money, and it's also very, very possible that they might lose their money quite quickly. It's not so stable as being in the landed gentry. They also don't tend to be as educated as people from the kind of old upper classes. Society can't make up its mind as to whether manufacturers are gentlemen or not, and this is something really interestingly explored in both North and South and in Hard Times. Margaret Hale in North and South has a great difficulty knowing whether or not she should place Mr. Thornton as a gentleman. There's even a whole chapter called Men and Gentlemen in which she has like a long internal debate about what a gentleman and a man is, and then Mr. Thornton and her have a chat about it. Like, it's such a massive important issue within the Victorian period because there is this whole new class of wealthy people, but they're not exactly ladies and gentlemen, so where do you place them? The same with Mr. Bounderby in Hard Times, who is very, very determined that he is not a gentleman, and yet he has quite a lot of money and very much looks down on workers. He sets himself apart from them. So what class do these people belong in? It's just really hard to know. And there is this big debate in both of these books between old money and new money, but more between new money and old culture, because in North and South, like a family like the Hales, a person like Margaret, whose father was a clergyman, they're not rich and they never have been. She views herself as above Mr. Thornton because he's a manufacturer and she is a lady. Even though his family is far wealthier than hers, she considers that she is socially above him. We have the difference between a character like Mr. Bounderby, who is a manufacturer, and James Harthouse, who is a gentleman. Or if you look at Mr. Bounderby and Mrs. Sparset, his housekeeper, who, despite being his housekeeper and his paid dependent, is a born lady, and he likes to tell everyone that she is a born lady, despite the fact that he is not a born gentleman and does not care for such things. It's a great concern for the Victorians, especially in industrial towns, that they don't know where to place these people. And I quickly want to compare Mr. Bounderby as a manufacturer and Mr. Thornton as a manufacturer, because Mr. Thornton and Mr. Bounderby are really quite different characters. And when you think about the fact that in North and South it is Mr. Thornton who is the embodiment of what a manufacturer is, and in Hard Times it is Mr. Bounderby, it tells you quite a lot about Elizabeth Gaskell and Charles Dickens' different opinions on manufacturers and on industrialisation as a whole. Mr. Thornton is a very sympathetic character. It's very significant that in North and South we do get to see in Mr. Thornton's head quite a lot, and I think some of the passages from his perspective are some of the most beautiful things that Elizabeth Gaskell has ever written. There are some wonderful, wonderful bits from his perspective. He has a voice in the book, both in the sense that he has a lot of conversations with Margaret and her father about industrialisation and about the world, and also in the fact that we get to look inside his head. And I think we like Mr. Thornton. I think I'm not alone in saying that you do like Mr. Thornton. Margaret may find him impolite, rough, and to have a bit of a temper. He may sometimes say things that we don't agree with, but in general, Mr. Thornton is presented as a good, kind, and sympathetic character. Mr. Bounderby, however, one of the most dislikable characters in all of Dickens. And not only is Mr. Bounderby horrible, he is also really inconsiderate, he's also really selfish, he's also a complete hypocrite, he's cruel, he's a bully, and in general he's just kind of everything bad. If you take Mr. Bounderby as Charles Dickens's example manufacturer, he really doesn't think very highly of manufacturers. Both Mr. Thornton and Mr. Bounderby are self-made men, but the attitude they have towards the fact that they are self-made men and the way that they talk about it is very, very, very different. So Mr. Bounderby says, I hadn't a shoe to my foot, as to a stocking I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch. This is how Mr. Bounderby likes to talk about the fact that he was a self-made man. And now, let us look at the way that Mr. Thornton likes to talk about the fact that he's a self-made man. 16 years ago, my father died in very miserable circumstances. I was taken from school and had to become a man as well as I could in a few days. I had such a mother as few are blessed with, a woman of strong power and firm resolve. We went into a small country town where living was cheaper than in Milton and where I got employment in a draper's shop, a capital place, by the way, for obtaining knowledge of goods. Week by week our income came to 15 shillings, out of which 3 people had to be kept. My mother managed so that I put by 3 out of the 15 shillings regularly. This made the beginning. This taught me self-denial. Now I am able to afford my mother such comforts as her age rather than her own wish requires. I thank her silently on each occasion for the early training she gave me. I feel that in my own case it is no good luck, nor merit, nor talent, but simply the habits of life which have taught me to despise indulgences not thoroughly earned. And this, I think, is possibly the only time in the whole novel that Mr. Thornton talks about the fact that he's a self-made man. Mr. Bounderby likes to tell everyone he can how awful his started life was and what a horrible life he's had and how well he has done for himself because of that, whereas Mr. Thornton is really quite quiet about it. And it's really hard to properly compare Hard Times and North and South because they are such different novels. Like, Hard Times is much more caricatured, it's much less of a realist novel than North and South is, so to compare Mr. Bounderby and Mr. Thornton it's a little bit simplistic because Mr. Thornton is a much more complex character than Mr. Bounderby, and I think purposely so in terms of both of these authors' intentions, but it's still very interesting to look at it in terms of Elizabeth Gaskell's slightly more sympathetic portrayal of industrialisation in comparison to the way that Charles Dickens basically presents industrialisation and manufacturers as everything that is bad and hypocritical about the world. And it's important too that the industrial workers are a new class, and in general I think Victorian society or the Victorian elites have less trouble about this because they're still lower class and the Victorian elites kind of don't care. It doesn't bother them as much as where to place manufacturers who are wealthy, and they like people who are wealthy and they want to know where to place them. And yet, I do think it's very important that in both of these books the urban working classes are presented as being very different to the agricultural working classes. One of the things Margaret notices in her friendships with factory workers in North and South is that a lot of the time, these people who work in factories have a lot of things that would be considered luxuries to people in rural areas, and yet sometimes they struggle for food. Their quality of life is much more unstable, and while they have some things which people in rural areas would never have, they also sometimes struggle to get food because it's just not available, because prices go up and down so much, because living in cities is very different. They also tend to live in very cramped conditions because that is what cities are like. Elizabeth Gaskell writes about how the people in these working towns have clothes that look very shabby in comparison to people who work in rural areas, but that actually the quality of the material is much better because it's really good cotton, the kind that they have been making in mills. And although the factory workers in North and South have very, very hard lives and many are really struggling to make ends meet and to have enough food for their children, they're also really snobby about the idea of being servants, for example. And when the Hales are trying to hire a servant, none of the girls who work in Milton want to do it because they consider factory work above that. It's also really interesting to look at the role of education within these two books because the urban working classes in North and South and Hard Times are presented as being much better educated than the rural working classes. A lot of the rural classes are illiterate, whereas the urban working classes definitely can read. In Hard Times we're given a very short, brief description of the house in which Stephen lives, but it's important that he has books and writing implements in his house. In North and South, Bessie frequently quotes the Bible, which she reads a lot, and Bessie's father, Nicholas Higgins, talks about the poetry he's read, as well as having read bits of the Bible. These urban working classes are much better educated than their equivalent in rural areas. And because there are these two new important classes, we get a lot of new class conflicts. And the impact of industrialisation on class conflict and on the struggle between classes in these two books is really, really interesting. Where Margaret comes from in North and South, in Helston, there doesn't really seem to be any conflict between any classes. Nobody really seems to mind what class they are, and everyone kind of accepts their place. place. But then when she gets to Milton, there is a lot of class conflict, and this she finds really hard to understand. She doesn't understand why the workers and the masters and the men are so often against each other. Likewise, in Hard Times, characters like Stephen or like the union leader Slackbridge very much feel that manufacturers are a lot of the time against them, whereas the manufacturer character like Mr. Bounderby very much feels that the workers are out for everything they can get and are definitely not good people. Lastly, said Mr. Bounderby, as to our hands, there's not a hand in this town, sir, man or woman or child, but has one ultimate object in life. That object is to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. Now, they're not going, none of them, ever to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. And now you know the place. This is how Mr. Bounderby introduces the town of Coketown to a new gentleman who comes there, Mr. Harthouse, which tells you quite a lot about the state of class conflict within the town of Coketown in Hard Times. And then in North and South, Mr. Thornton calls relations between masters and men a battle. Margaret says that she has never lived in a place before where there were two sets of people always running each other down. Nicholas Higgins says that the master's role is to beat us down, to swell their fortunes, and it's ours to stand up and fight hard. Mr. Thornton's mother says that all of the workers want to be masters and make the masters into slaves on their own ground. They're always trying at it, they always have it in their minds, and every 5 or 6 years there comes a struggle between masters and men. Class conflict and the division between workers and factory owners is so important in both of these books that literally there are 2 chapters, a chapter in each book that has the same name. In North and South there is a chapter called Masters and Men, and in Hard Times there is a chapter called Men and Masters, which is kind of symbolic of the fact that both of these books are really, really interested in and very strongly explore the division between masters and men, the fact that these 2 huge groups in society just cannot get along, and the fact that industrialisation has created this massive class conflict. Next, and this is the final point I want to make in the non-spoilery section of this video, I want to talk about the industrialisation of the mind, and this is what Hard Times, I would say, is kind of mostly about. So I'm going to read you a few passages from the beginning of Hard Times which examine the role of facts within Victorian society, the idea that by industrialising society and economics, the Victorian period has also kind of industrialised people's heads, and now people are only thinking in terms of selling and buying, they're only thinking in terms of facts and capitalism. The idea that the more society depends on machines, the more individuals within that society become like machines. This is how the novel Hard Times opens, and Mr. Gradgrind is speaking to children at school. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. And then a few pages later, when Dickens describes Thomas Gradgrind as a character. Thomas Gradgrind, sir, a man of realities, a man of facts and calculation, a man who proceeds upon the principle that 2 and 2 are 4 and nothing over, and who is not to be talked into allowing for anything over. With a rule and a pair of scales and the multiplication table always in his pocket, sir, ready to weigh and measure any parcel of human nature and tell you exactly what it comes to. It is a mere question of figures, a case of simple arithmetic. This idea that Thomas Gradgrind, who is this hard fact man, who is an MP standing on the basis of political economy, on facts, on utilitarianism, the best for the greatest number, because economically and statistically that is what makes sense. The idea is that this man has been industrialised along with his town. He has become like a machine in the way that he thinks. This is an incredibly, incredibly important aspect of Hard Times, and this is what Charles Dickens is chiefly criticising in this. He criticises the effect that industry has on the lives of workers, he criticises the effect that industry has on the landscape, but more than anything else in Hard Times, what Charles Dickens criticises about industrialisation is the effect that it has on people's minds, the effect that it has on culture and intellectualism, the effect that it effectively has on philosophy, even though someone like Thomas Gradgrind would never deign to be interested in philosophy. The idea that industrialisation is something that doesn't just happen to the landscape or to the city, it also happens to people themselves, it happens to people's minds and hearts. I'm going to talk later in the spoilery section about how Charles Dickens resolves this and about the complications of this later on in the book, about the conclusion Charles Dickens comes to as to what is the solution to this. But if you haven't read this book yet, I think it's suffice to say that this is one of the most interesting things in Hard Times, the industrialisation of the mind. Fascinating. This issue is explored much less in North and South, but it is still very much there. One of the things that Margaret finds quite strange in moving to Milton is how differently people behaved, people in their employ, or the very different way that people of upper classes behave to the lower classes in Milton in comparison to the way they behaved in Helston, where she's from. She doesn't understand why Mr. Thornton doesn't take more concern over the lives of the people who work in his mills, why he isn't more worried about them, why he doesn't do more to improve their lives. There's a particular passage that arises when Margaret and Thornton are kind of having a debate about whether or not workers have a right to know what the masters are doing with their money, and Margaret says, "All I meant to say is that there is no human law to prevent the employers from utterly wasting or throwing away all their money, if they chose. But rather, there are passages in the Bible which would imply, at least to me, that they neglected their duty as stewards if they did so." But it's a similar issue in North and South as it is to hard times. The idea that industrialisation drives masters as well as workers to only think about things in terms of capital and in terms of what they have to do, in terms of what will make good business decisions rather than in terms of what will make good moral decisions. Margaret is saying to Thornton that yes, okay, so there is one law imposed by the government, but there are also religious or moral laws that might make you behave in a different way. The idea that industrialisation is kind of sapping morality in some way. Anyway, that is all I have to say for the spoiler-free section of this video, so very soon I will go on with the other 4 points I have to make, all of which will be full of spoilers, telling you everything about what happens in the book. So please, if you have not read this book, stop watching now, you have been forewarned. Moving on. So continuing, for those who have read the books, I want to talk about the role of trade unionism in both of these two books because I think it's really, really interesting to look at. In hard times, trade unions are bad. They are presented as bad. If you consider the character of Slackbridge, who is the trade union leader within the town of Coketown, he is presented as a pretty bad, awful man in every respect. He was not so honest, he was not so manly, he was not so good-humoured. He substituted cunning for their simplicity and passion for their safe, solid sense. The idea is that Mr. Slackbridge is a much worse man than the men he is leading. There's a slightly patronising idea within hard times that the workers who join trade unions don't actually really want to be there, and they're kind of misled by people like Slackbridge. They have difficult lives, they are struggling, and so they are driven to join unions that are led by men like this. But although Stephen does not join the union, he does at one point speak out to Mr. Bounderby, at least to the extent that he understands why people join them and he defends people's right to join them. What Dickens kind of says in Hard Times is that he understands why trade unions happen, and he understands that there are problems in the way that factories work and the way that workers' lives are, which result in unions, but that for him the unions are really not the solution. Trade unions in a kind of roundabout way killed Stephen. Stephen refuses to join the trade unions. All the rest of the workers therefore turn their backs on him, therefore Mr. Bounderby is suspicious of him, therefore he ends up getting fired, therefore he ends up going away, he ends up being called into suspicion, and ultimately on his way back into Coketown he dies. Obviously there are a lot of other things there at Mr. Bounderby. Let's be honest, Tom Gradgrind Jr. are just as much to blame for Stephen's ultimate death, but trade unionism certainly has a role to play in it, and Dickens presents it very poorly. If you look at the way Charles Dickens explains what happens when all the members of the union just ignore Stephen, when they cut him out completely of their society, he makes it very clear that the way unions behave is disgusting to him. Thus easily did Stephen Blackpool fall into the loneliest of lives, the life of solitude amongst a familiar crowd. The stranger in the land who looks into 10,000 faces for some answering look and never finds it, is in cheery society compared with him who passes 10 averted faces daily that were once the countenances of friends. Such experience was to be Stephen's now, in every waking moment of his life, at work, on his way to it, and from it, at the door, at his window, everywhere. By general consent, they each avoided that side of the street on which he habitually walked, and left it, all of the working men, to him only. And it is horrible what the union does to Stephen within hard times. It is horrible, and it definitely strongly emphasises Dickens's distrust of trade unions and how very strongly he feels that they are not the solution to the problems. He admits the problems are there, but he really doesn't think that trade unionism is doing anything to help them. In North and South, however, the presentation of trade unions is much, much more complex. It is not entirely good. While the trade union sort of indirectly may lead Stephen to his death in hard times, the trade union kind of pretty directly leads Boucher to his death in North and South. The strike is generally presented as awful. There are a lot of people starving. There are speeches where Boucher is talking to Higgins about the state of his family, where you cannot help but feel that the union, as Margaret says at one point, is a tyrant, where the trade union is this awful force that can destroy people's lives, that can force people into starvation. However, if you compare Higgins as a trade union member and a fairly high up member to Slackbridge as a trade union leader in hard times, it is so different. And I think in North and South, Elizabeth Gaskell really effectively and really interestingly examines the role of trade unions and why people are drawn to them, and why, even if they're not necessarily right, even if strikes are dangerous and bad, she also examines why trade unions might be necessary and why they're important and why Higgins feels so strongly about his. Higgins says of Margaret, who doesn't comprehend the union for all that. It's a great power, it's our only power. I read a bit of poetry about a plough going over a daisy has made tears come into my eyes before I had other cause for crying. But the chap never stopped driving the plough. I warrant for all he was pitiful about the daisy. He had too much mother wit for that. The union's the plough, making ready the land for harvest time. Such as Boucher, 'twould be setting him up too much to liken to him a daisy. He's liken a weed lounging over the ground, and to just make up their mind to be put out the way. I'm sore vexed with him just now. So may happen, I dare not speak fair of him. I could go over him with a plough myself, with all the pleasure in life. This idea that the union is the only thing they have to make their voices heard within society, and therefore it must be bigger than them, it must be bigger than individual cases of starvation and death. And Higgins's view of the trade union does change slightly over time, but it's important that even after Boucher's suicide, he still paid his union dues and he was still a member of the union. In North and South, the trade unions may not be perfect, but they're presented to a certain extent as being more sympathetic and more understandable than they are in hard times, and certainly, although they are presented as a great power for evil, they are also presented as having the power for good as well. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the life of factory workers. So let's start off with looking at the Higginses, especially Bessie Higgins in North and South. In North and South, Bessie Higgins dies. The disease that she has that has ruined her life and makes her die at the age of about 20 is caused by the fumes and the little bits of cotton and the cotton particles of the factory where she worked at as a child. Bessie is a fascinating character. She does, on the one hand, stand for thousands of young people, of children and young adults who died because of the dangers of working in factories, who died from injuries caused by accidents in factories, or who died from diseases contracted due to the working conditions of factories. But on the other hand, she's also a very intelligent, interesting and moral person. She is, in many ways, what Margaret would be if Margaret was of that class. They share a lot of things in common in terms of their personality. Bessie has as much heroism as Margaret, and her death is just as tragic as all of the many deaths that take place in North and South, in many ways more so because she is the youngest person in North and South to die. Similarly, if you look at the character of Boucher and the awful life he leads, and he is not presented with any heroicism unlike Bessie, but still his life is pitiful, his life is awful, he has had this terrible, horrible life. And Elizabeth Gaskell very, very interestingly uses Boucher and also uses Bessie to examine the lives of workers within these factory towns and how awful and how hard they really could be. Likewise, Stephen in Hard Times is shown to have a very, very difficult life. The fact that he has this alcoholic wife who is terrible to him and abusive towards him, who he hates so much, and who, if he could divorce if he was wealthy, he goes to Mr. Bounderby about this issue and he says to him, in God's name, show me the law to help me. But there is no law to help him. If he had money, there would be, but for people like Stephen, there is no law to help him. And this is symbolic of many, many aspects of the workers' lives. As I said earlier, Hard Times is one of those strange Dickens novels which doesn't really feel that it has a hero or heroine. If it does have a heroine, it's probably Sissy Jupe or Rachel. But if it has a hero, it probably is Stephen Blackpool. When he goes to see Mr. Bounderby before he gets fired from his position, he says a lot of very interesting, important things about the role of workers. Dickens uses him as the mouthpiece for his social criticism. There are two very interesting things about the fact that Dickens uses Stephen to voice this social criticism. One is that rather than putting this social criticism into the voice of someone middle class or upper class, it's important in this book that it's someone who works in the factory, not anyone higher up, who can identify the real problems with this society. The other thing that's interesting is that although he gives it to Stephen, he makes it really hard to understand. Stephen talks in a very, very thick dialect. Rachel doesn't. Yet Stephen has some of the most important, interesting, fascinating speeches in the book where he's talking about the problems within Victorian society, and yet they're really hard to read. And I'm trying to work out the significance of why Dickens did this, because I feel it's partly to do with the fact that the voice of the workers within 19th century society was not understood, the fact that people were not understanding people like Stephen, and that's partly why Dickens makes him speak in a voice that we find hard to understand. Indeed, we are in a muddle, sir. Look round town, so rich as 'tis, and see the numbers of people that have been brought into being here, for to weave and to card and to piece out a living, all the same way, somehow, twixt their cradles and their graves. Look how we live, and where we live, and in what numbers, and by what chances, and with what sameness, and look how the mills is always a-going, how they never works us no nigher to any distant object, except in always death. Look how you considers of us and writes of us and talks of us and goes up with your deputations to secretaries of states about us, and how you are always right and how we are always wrong, and never had no reason in us since we were born. Look how this has grown and grown, and, sir, bigger and bigger and broader, harder and harder for year to year, from generation to generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis not a muddle? I cannot with my little learning and my common way tell the gentleman what will better all this, though some working men of this town could above my powers, but I can tell him what will never do it. The strong hand will never do it. victory and triumph will never do it. Agreeing for to make one side always unnaturally and forever right, and t'other side unnaturally always and forever wrong, will never doing it. Nor letting alone will never do it. Let thousands upon thousands alone, all leading the like liars and all falling into the like muddle, and they will be as one and you will be as another. The black unpassable world betwixt you, just as long and as short as a time a stitch-like misery can last. It is written in a way that is hard to understand and is hard to read. Aside from the dialect, the phraseology of it, like the way that Dickens sets out the speech makes it really tricky to understand, which I do think is purposeful. I do think it's to do with the fact that Stephen is misunderstood on so many levels. He's pointing out the very adverse effects of industrialisation on the lives of working individuals. Another thing I want to talk about in these two books is the effects of industrialisation on morality and religion. There's a lot of worry in both of North and South and Hard Times from a lot of people that factory workers are not religious. In Hard Times, people of the middle and upper classes in Coketown really think that everyone or in the working classes in Coketown doesn't believe in God and doesn't go to church and is really immoral. In North and South we have quite a mix. We have the character of Bessie Higgins, who is very religious, who quotes from the Bible an awful lot, and because her life has been so terrible and she knows that she's going to die soon, basically like her only hope in life is religion and heaven. And then we have Nicholas Higgins, who is kind of an agnostic. There is the implication a lot of times in the book that he doesn't necessarily believe in God, although he wavers on whether or not he does believe in God, which for the Victorian period is quite scandalous. And at the times that he does believe in God, he is very angry with God because he feels that life is very unfair. He feels that a lot of the workers is unfair. He feels that his daughter's illness is unfair. He is not a religious man. He is the kind of factory worker that many people within the Victorian elite were really worried existed. They were really concerned about the immorality and unreligiousness of the working classes. But Elizabeth Gaskell does a lot to fight against these claims and these worries, these concerns within Victorian society. Partly she does it by the fact that Nicholas Higgins is not an atheist, and although he is very angry towards God, at times he says things which in the Victorian period would have been considered blasphemous. He does believe in God, he does pray at various points in the book, and he also, regardless of anything to do with religion, he's a very moral man. Look at the way he takes care about his children after their death. Look at the way that he thinks and speaks about his daughters. Look at the way he talks to Margaret. He is a moral man, he is a kind man, he is a good man, and Elizabeth Gaskell stresses this very much, that as well as religion, another key aspect of worries about morality in the Victorian period is the worries that the working classes just drank all the time. Like, this was a serious worry for a lot of people within the Victorian period. You can see it very clearly in both North and South in Hard Times. Bessie is always worried in North and South about how much her father drinks or about him going to the pub to drown his sorrows. And then in Hard Times, if you look at the presentation of Stephen's wife, who is an alcoholic, there is in both of these novels an admission by both of these authors that drink could be a problem amongst factory workers, but also an admission that this is the exception rather than the rule. Stephen and Rachel and the majority of the workforce mentioned in Hard Times behave in a very different way, and in North and South, although Higgins may drink too much at some points, that doesn't make him a bad man at all, and Elizabeth Gaskell is quite keen to stress this. In fact, if you look at both of these books and the presentation of the morality of working class characters, it's really significant, because both of these books are fighting their best in their best social criticism that Gaskell and Dickens can do, to fight against the misconception amongst a lot of the Victorian elite at this time that factory workers were innately immoral. As well as being important to the plot, it's also really symbolically significant in Hard Times that it is not Stephen who robs the bank, it is Tom Gradgrind Jr. Society and Mr. Bounderby assumes that the culprit must be this disgruntled worker, and actually it's not. It is someone who works in the bank himself. It is someone who is considered, to a certain extent, a gentleman. This is really symbolically important in terms of Dickens's social criticism and Dickens's fight to say that actually, no, industrialisation may have a lot of problems, but industrialisation hasn't necessarily created mass immorality amongst the working classes. In fact, to be honest, what Dickens is suggesting in Hard Times is that rather than industrialisation creating immorality amongst the working classes, industrialisation creates immorality amongst the people at the top of the food chain within manufacturing. It creates immorality amongst the manufacturers and their families. And finally, this has been a long video, I want to talk about the solutions in both of these books. Both of these books put forward massive, huge problems that industrialisation has caused within society, within the economy, within culture, within the way people think. What do they suggest the solution is? Because I think this is really interesting. Because in Hard Times, the solution is the circus. The solution for Charles Dickens to industrialisation, to the dangers it has wrought on people's lives and also on people's minds, to the solution to the industrialisation of the mind, the solution to the way that society is becoming due to industrialisation is imagination, love, and the circus. It's incredibly significant that the people who rescue Tom at the end of the book, the people that mean that Tom doesn't have to go to prison for the rest of his life, are the circus performers. The fact that it is Sissy Jupe, the daughter of a clown who is very emotional and loving, who could never understand statistics. The fact that it is her who chases away James Harthouse, who gets rid of Louisa's lover who was trying to tempt her into an affair. The fact that it's Sissy who does that is really, really important. But she, like Sleary at the end with Tom, as an embodiment of the circus, symbolically is saving industrialised society. Towards the end of Hard Times, Thomas Gradgrind finally realises that there is a wisdom of the head and there is a wisdom of the heart. And this is an incredibly important turning moment in the book. And this is what the book is basically saying. This is the central message of Hard Times. Okay, so with industrialisation, Victorian society is now focused on political economy. Everyone is political economists. Everyone is a hard fact man. Everyone wants to focus on the factual elements of society. But actually, if you just look at the facts, the hard, raw facts of the world, and if you just look at statistics, you miss out on all the nuances. You miss out on proper human relationships. You don't understand how people feel. Hard Times is essentially a book about how you can conquer the dangers of industrialisation and the intellectual effects of it with good education and with storybooks, with emotion, with the circus. You can conquer the industrialisation of the mind with love. That is what Hard Times is saying, and that is Dickens' solution. It's not a very practical one, but it's a very Dickensian one, and that kind of makes me a bit happy anyway. North and South's solution is a bit more complicated because, unlike in Hard Times where industrialisation kind of loses and is conquered by love, North and South is a bit different. North and South is much less about a conflict in which one sort of argument wins and much more about a coalition of ideas. North and South is much more about settling conflicts through compromise. North and South is much more about different people weighing up their arguments and managing to meet in the middle. North and South does not say we should shift our focus from this to the other. North and South says we should focus on everything, we should consider everything, we should consider different sides of point of views. In North and South, at the end of the book, Margaret and Thornton, by ending up together, by assumedly marrying a few pages after the end of the book, they bring together North and the South and they manage to kind of combine them and resolve their differences. They also bring together Margaret's kind of paternalism and emphasis on improving people's lives and Mr. Thornton's individualism and desire for freedom. It's also really important that Mr. Thornton loses his mill, and what supports him in the end is Margaret's money, which has come from Mr. Bell, who was an Oxford Don, who was part of the old educated cultural sphere, the old culture. So therefore in their marriage they also bring together like the old culture versus new money thing, and that's just great. I love it. It makes me very happy. Similarly, in the friendship between Nicholas Higgins and Mr. Thornton that we see developed in the latter half of the book, the way that Mr. Thornton lets and supports Higgins in his scheme to set up this kitchen, this canteen on site. The fact that when Mr. Thornton loses his money and loses his mill, Higgins sends round this big paper and has a long list for Mr. Thornton of all the men who would be willing to work for him again. This friendship between Nicholas Higgins and Mr. Thornton is the symbolic reconciliation of masters and men, of factory owners and factory workers, and that is incredibly, incredibly significant. We've already heard Dickens' solution. Here is Elizabeth Gaskell's solution to industrialisation. We should understand each other better, and I'll venture to say we should like each other more. So on that important and interesting thought, I'm going to end this video because I have been talking for an obscenely long time. It's like getting dark outside. I have been filming for nearly 2 hours now, and I think it's about time I stop because this video is going to take me an insane amount of time to edit. I have greatly enjoyed discussing industrialisation in North and South and Hard Times because I love both of these books very much, and I love industrialisation, and I had so many exciting things to say. I hope you have enjoyed this video too. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of these two books if you've read them, which I hope you have if you're still here, and what you thought of the role of industrialisation within them and so on. So that is all for today. I hope you have enjoyed this very, very long video. I am very impressed if you have made it all the way to the end. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. Thank you, hypothetical students. The class is now dismissed.